Let's talk about whole disk encryption for Linux. VeraCrypt, which we've gone through, cannot do whole disk encryption for Linux, but it is a good option for Linux for container and partition encryption. But we're going to talk about whole disk encryption here. Many GNU Linux distributions, for instance Debian, support on-the-fly encryption, decryption for the entire disk as a standard feature, and you can decide to use it when you install the operating system, which is the easiest way of installing it. And here in front of you, you can see examples of the install screen where you can select to install whole disk encryption or encryption. And what they use is the Encrypt kernel module and LUKS, LUKS, Linux Unified Key Setup extension. And for most people, I recommend installing whole disk encryption at the install stage, but with some extra tweaks after, which I'm going to go through. This gives you the best security, but with the least deep knowledge of Linux required, therefore the least chance of configuring it insecurely. There are actually many ways Decrypt and LUKS can be configured, but the default on install is good for most people. So let's talk about the good points of Decrypt and LUKS. Against crypto algorithm and brute force attacks, it offers all the algorithm options that you might want. AES, Anubis, Cast56, Twofish, Serpent, Camellia, Blowfish, etc. Every cipher the kernel crypto API offers. And the default on Debian is, as you can see here, it's AES with 512-bit key and XTS plain 64 mode of operation, so it's nice and solid as default. And you can see here that it's also using SHA-1. SHA-1 is used as the hash. And I have mentioned that SHA-1 is academically broken for finding collisions, but not for using it as a key derivation function, as is done here, so it's perfectly fine. Decrypt and LUKS are open source with no known backdoors or implementation issues. They have been well scrutinized over time. One of the strengths and weaknesses of Decrypt and LUKS is that it's extremely configurable, flexible, with lots of third-party support, which is great if you know what you're doing, but it's not so great if you don't, and complexity is the nemesis of security. You can do complex setups like using dedicated passphrase plus USB stick with key file for authentication to reduce the attack surface. Lots of configurable options. Or another example here, you can use Decrypt in plain mode, i.e. that's without the LUKS header and its option for multiple keys, allowing for plausible deniability, i.e. you can't tell that the drive is encrypted when you use plain Decrypt mode. But these options I've been talking about here, they're complex. They're complex unless you are a Linux expert. But it does provide the most amount of flexibility to enable you to cope with and mitigate many of the disk decryption attacks. With a third-party module, there is LUKS support for storing keys in TPM NVRAM. I've not tested this out though, but it is available. It has pre-boot authentication, it can go with multi-factor authentication, and you can even use the YubiKey for two-factor authentication. There's a guide on how to set that up here. And if you use Grub, it's possible to encrypt the bootloader, which I'll show you how to do shortly, which will reduce the attack surface. It supports containers, and it is fast. Now for some of the negatives of Decrypt and LUKS. Debian does support UEFI and GPT, but does not yet support UEFI secure boot, but work is ongoing to enable this in future releases. There are no hidden containers. It is harder to configure for plausible deniability, although it is possible, and it has no portable functionality. Crypt Setup is the command line tool to administer encryption once it is installed. There is no GUI apart from on install where you set up whole disk encryption or encryption of some sort. And what I've alluded to before, one of the main negatives is it's complex to use. Even understanding all the names involved in using LUKS is complex. Decrypt, crypt setup, LUKS, etc., and their relationships together. People just find that confusing. Any specialist setup other than what comes on install requires a good technical knowledge of Linux partitions, LVMs, Decrypt, crypt setup, LUKS, and cryptography, which most people just don't have. Documentation is also hard to understand for newbies. Decrypt and LUKS are recommended for Linux users who are concerned about their device being lost or stolen and their data accessed, and with the right configuration, it is a strong encryption option against well-resourced adversaries if you have the technical capability to set it up and maintain it. Other encryption options are available for Linux and Debian and Kali, but Decrypt and LUKS is what is supported out of the box.